we were just reminiscing about the very first Thicket Forum back in 2005, 4, I can't remember. I've now been here in the Eastern Cape for exactly 20 years, and for all of that time, there's always been a discussion around the evolutionary affinities, the floristic affinities. Where does Thicket exactly belong? Is it globally unique? Is it a bit of everything? And this goes all the way back to work by Richard Cowling for his PhD. So the backstory to this is that I've been interested in those aspects of thickets for a long time. But a couple of years ago, my colleague Muthama Mwasia from UCT and I were chatting about possible collaboration and around evolution and ecology, and then this idea around thicket came up again. Is it really the mother of all vegetation types, etc., etc.? How do I make the slides move on? Otherwise, we could be stuck on this for half an hour. All right, I'll skip on the pointer. That's too scary.
Right this way?
Slideshow 101.
Are you going too far?
No, I haven't. I'm just swapping hands so I can. Right, so this needs no introduction to this audience, but Thicket, not so long ago, was identified and recognized as a distinct biome, and the official delineation that we have, thanks to Machina and Rutherford, but also the work by Flock and Houston Brown, is that it is essentially the vegetation that falls into the aseasonal rainfall zone. So where there's no more than, I don't remember, it's 40% winter or summer rainfall. Before that, when the thicket was first officially delineated by Lowe and Rebello, they included the summer rainfall areas, and I'll show that in a moment. And back in the day, Richard Cowling, that was before many of yours birth dates, I think, divided thicket into succulent and non-succulent forms. So even though it's recognized that thicket is a single biome, distinct from savanna, distinct from karoo, distinct from forest, there are two quite distinct forms, and I think Alistair will talk more about that, with the succulent form showing strong floristic relationships to the karoo namib phytochorion. So it has got the mesomes, the crassulas, the euphorbias that are typical also of the karoo and the arid areas. And then the latter, which is closer to the summer rainfall areas and a bit more mesic, has got affinities to the tropical forests of the Tongaland, Ponderland phytochoria. So those are the coastal belt forests. And Potts-Perscom, I hope I'm not misquoting this, has alluded to the fact that perhaps the more mesic types of thicket, from a functional, floristic, and I suspect also conservation point of view, might be more sensibly grouped in with the forests. So even though this has had a lot of interest for since the 80s, some of these issues aren't 100% resolved. And I'm not promising to resolve them here. Whoa, now I have totally skipped. Oh, I've skipped way too far. All right. Okay, so as I've said, the floristics, evolution, and ecology of thicket have had a lot of interest, but there's still some questions to remain. And the ones that I'll be focusing on are, firstly, is it a single floristically distinct biome? Because I also work quite a bit in savannas, and in savannas you often get parts of savanna that are very thicket-like. They're fire-free, they're often found in valleys, and are even called valley bushveld in the Machina and Rutherford map. But also, when woody encroachment sort of changes the savanna to a fire-free, closed canopy woody vegetation, it often has many characteristics of thicket. So I've been curious whether the valley bushveld types in the summer rainfall areas are not floristically also close to thicket. So that's what Lowe and Rebello called thicket, but Machina and Rutherford decided is not. What's the place of the mosaic types? So we all know thicket is a complicated beast. And lastly, this question of whether the mesic thicket types actually are closer to forest than to the other thicket types, the more succulent thicket types. Okay, gentle on the button. Okay, so because it's sort of in the middle between winter and summer rainfall, and it's in the sub-escarpment zone between the coast and the mountains, there is definitely something transitional about Thicket, and it's got complex affinities with the biomes that surround it. It shares elements with the different biomes, including the Karoo and the forests. But also, structurally and functionally similar vegetation is found elsewhere in Africa and globally where climate is dry and with sort of seasonally unpredictable rainfall. And you get certain elements like the Sansevieras, the Cercias, and so on. You get patches of very similar vegetation elsewhere in Africa, minus the sort of charoid elements. And Richard Cowling and others proposed that Thicket here might represent a sort of remnant of the ancestral dry vegetation or seasonally dry vegetation that in large parts of Africa was later replaced by savannas and grasslands, but only really spread in the last 10 or less fewer million years. So this is a map from that Cowling et al. 2005 paper, and it shows in black those areas that Lowe and Rebello mapped as subtropical thicket. So you'll see this all looks very familiar, but then they included all these areas of valley bushveld, including the huge Tugela Valley in KZN, in the thicket biome because it's fire-free, it's closed canopy, it has got euphorbias, it's got aloes. When you're there, it's remarkably reminiscent of the thicket we have down here. And then in the dark gray are shown other vegetation types that are not classified as thickets, not even by Lowe and Rebello, that contain areas, fairly extensive areas or patches of thicket. So it just shows that thicket isn't the simple thing that we just find here in the Eastern Cape, and people have been wrestling with where exactly to place it. All right, that one we've covered. This thing is so scary. All right, so Muthama and I discussed identifying lineages, processes, just things to try and look at from a sort of evolutionary and ecological point of view. And I mentioned to him that I've been looking at relationships between thicket and savanna, and whether thicket and savanna can maybe be alternative stable states under low rainfall, the way forests and savannas can be alternative stable states in more mesic sites that are separated by fire. And the question again came up, well, where does it exactly fit in? Where are the affinities? And we decided to start with a multivariate analysis using the common taxa identified in the veg map vegetation types. So I don't know if you are all familiar with the vegetation map, but for each vegetation type, after a description of what it looks like and the climate and the soils and so on, there's a list of so-called important taxa, which are basically species that are very abundant, very characteristics, or special endemics of note. And Nikki Berg and co-authors, which included Richard, did something similar for the Greater Cape Floristic region in the first chapter of their book on fynbos, to sort of look at how well do the vegetation types in the veg map describe floristically the renosterveld, the succulent karoo, the fynbos, and they included a few of the subtropical thicket types. So we took we got it from Sanby, we took the list of important taxa, we then compiled it at just the genus level. So if a vegetation type had 3 species of crassula listed under important taxa, we would then have 3 as the sort of abundance of that genus. And we did cluster analyses and ordination to see how the different vegetation types sort of fitted in. So this is the analysis that Berg and others did for the Greater Cape Floristic region using pretty much the same method. So they used a correspondence analysis, and what they found that generally there was really good support for fynbos being different from succulent karoo, for renosterveld being distinct from both. And then they included 5 of the then only 14 subtropical thicket vegetation types and found that they too came out distinct with the Strandveld kind of coming out most similar to the thicket. So we decided that was a really interesting approach, and as a first stab at this is to use the same kind of data, but focus more on the relationship of thicket with the summer rainfall biomes. So the whole vegetation map has got a gazillion vegetation types. We whittled it down to just over 200, including all the different savannas, because that was one of the relationships we were interested in. The forest ones, the Indian Ocean coastal belt, which is this beige stuff, because that again contains many pockets of forest, thicket, savanna-like vegetation. In yellow, the actual thicket itself, a couple of the adjacent grassland types, and then a selection of Nama, succulent karoo, renosterveld, and fynbos. Sorry, the pink is fynbos, the greenish grey is succulent karoo. So we didn't take all of those because there's really a lot, and we tried to focus on those types that were sort of geographically closest. And so this is what we found when we did a non-metric multi-dimensional scaling with Bray-Curtis similarity. So the thicket is in yellow, and you can see that it comes out very much in its own sort of space, very neatly between the savannas, which are in orange, and then here the winter rainfall biomes. The fynbos in pink, the renosterveld in purple, the fishy green is the karoo, and then there's Strandveld also in light grey, and some of the Nama karoo. And then the forest in dark green is kind of quite scattered because the Afromontane and some of the coastal and some of the almost savanna-like forests are quite different actually. But you can see that there's a bit of intermingling of some of the forest and mesic thicket types. And then this was the cluster analysis. I'm going to do another equipment hand swap here. So there's quite a bit going on. So if you look at everything we've included, the first thing is that the savannas and grasslands are very much their own thing. And that includes low and ribellos, valley bushveld types in the summer rainfall region. So all of those vegetation types called something valley bushveld that I was convinced would come out with thicket because of the aloes and euphorbias are somewhere in the big savanna cluster. So Machina and Rutherford and Flock and Houston Brown were right about that on the floristic basis based on the important taxa. And then this cluster is the one that's more of interest to us, which I've magnified here. So the fynbos, and I just included a few of the eastern fynbos types that are close to the thicket, pretty distinct. And then sort of the karoo, renosterveld in its own cluster. And then here we have the big cluster that contains all of the thicket types. So again, they do come out in their own cluster, but oops, the forest is in with the thicket actually. And it clusters with the thicket types that are known as forest thicket, something mesic thicket, and some of the so-called grassland thickets. And then closest to that is another cluster with mosaic types, which includes actually quite a few of the more arid ones. So, but these are, generally speaking, the non-succulent thickets and thicket mosaics. And then in this cluster, we've got what I just dubbed the thicket archetype. So that's all the speckboomveld and the arid thickets and the valley thickets. Not all of them, but most of them. And closest to that is actually the dune thicket. Okay, so here we've got it a little bit more visible. You can see a couple of the renosterveld types come in with the mosaic, in this more general thicket cluster. It's worth remembering, though, this is based on the important taxa and just done at genus level. And that's obviously got a whole lot of drawbacks in that it lacks a whole lot of species that could be of interest and informative, and it's only done at genus level. It was impossible. The thing is, though, that is the one data that is available in a fairly consistent form for all the vegetation types. I mean, I could get species lists for some of the thickets, but then I wouldn't have equivalent species lists for other types. So it's worth remembering what this tells us and what it doesn't tell us. Okay. I then just did another cluster analysis simply with all the AT vegetation types, so just the Albany thicket ones. I'm going to redo one which includes the forest, but I haven't got there. And if one just looks at the clustering of the thicket vegetation types, which is obviously also of interest to us here, it's divided again into these two main clusters plus a couple of outliers. The first cluster is that archetypal thicket. And I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but you'll see valley thicket, Bornfeld, arid valley, arid valley. So these are really those succulent, drier thickets that Richard Cowling said were more affiliated or had some affinity with the Karoo-Nama phytochorion. And closest to them are 4 of the dune thickets. And then the second big cluster had these mesic thickets. So mesic valley, mesic grassland. So these are generally non-succulent thicket types. There are 2 forest thickets that really came out as more similar to forest. And then these other mosaics. And then a couple of types. The western Guarifeld came out in the Karoo, and the escarpment mesic thicket came out as more similar to savanna. Just want to go back a bit. So I'm sure you're wondering sort of who is who in this particular zoo. So this brown one is actually azonal vegetation. This is like the Alexandria dune forest. It's listed as a eastern Strandveld. These are those Umtisa and Sardinia forest thickets. And I can't remember which. This is southern coastal forest, so that's also the sort of around close to here. So you can see that from a sort of similarity of the important genera, there's definitely a bit of mixing up of the similar thicket types. Okay, so that's basically, we're still polishing this up, and we just want to publish it kind of almost as is, and then that should hopefully provide some food for thought for some more detailed analyses. Certainly the NMDS suggests that thicket occupies a distinct space, very much delineated by that aseasonal climate as recognized by Machina and Rutherford, and also Adrian Flock and Doug Houston Brown. And it sort of disagrees with Lowe and Rebello and my own hunch that the Eastern Valley bushvelds were part of the thicket biome from a floristic point of view. And the cluster analysis also suggests a distinct thicket cluster, and interestingly, the forests are actually nested. They are very much on their own subcluster, but they are sort of nested within that, which also, I guess, raises some interesting questions about where our forests here at the southern end of Africa fit in with the forests further north. Yeah, so as I've already said, my hunch about the summer rainfall valley bushveld types was not supported by this analysis, even though they do have a functionally, their physiognomy is quite reminiscent, and certain functional aspects are likely to be similar, like browser interactions, the sort of arid nature, etc. And the savannas overall form a very clear and distinct group that, as thicketiers, we don't have to worry about. Okay, let's do this. Ah, it's very hair trigger, this thing. Right, and then lastly, and I guess Alistair will pick up on that issue, is that the cluster analysis and the ordination suggest that 2 types of the forest thicket are definitely more similar to forest, and that there is quite a sort of similarity between some of the more mesic, non-succulent thicket types and forests, and that might warrant a closer investigation based on floristic, but also other ecological and functional criteria. And that is it. I just want to acknowledge Sanbi, and especially Anisha Diaram, who provided the data for this. Thank you.